Oh yeah, looking good, California. I like the part. Oh, just looking hot right now. It's not a great sign, especially since I'm like right there. And look at all the fires. Hooray. I think my throat has recovered for the morning. So I snore nowadays. Or I'm not nowadays. I've snored for like 10 plus years now. And that coupled with my living situation, I think it just irritates my throat in the morning. But today was so bad. I'm recording later than I meant to today because of that. And I blame this. I'm not a chemist or whatever, and I don't know a lot of really specific things about how some of this stuff works. Chemist, biologist, I don't know. I don't even know which field to point at. Probably all of them. But I'm just imagining the amount of, like, ash and smoke and whatever in the air. Probably is not great for me, is it? I'm pretty much staying indoors, and we do have filters set up. But I imagine that all that shit's probably not great for the water content of the air, is it? That might be why I'm waking up with a worse and worse condition voice and throat at times. Is just like, I think that's what's going on. That's my first guess anyway, is that the air is just getting worse, basically. So that's, you know, fun and all that. Summon my little health giver. There we go. Okay, so, first question. There's something else I want to cover too? Oh, right. The Patreon... People have been freaking out right now about Patreon's thing. They did a thing really well timed with this whole, like, me having a big boost on Patreon and everything. As far as that goes, basically what happened is Patreon moved its bank or whatever from the US to the UK. Probably, I assume, to dodge some kind of regulation or something that lets them have more money. Some people have suspected it might even be why that thing happened a year or so ago, where they tried something to get more money and then they undid that because people responded super negatively to it for really obvious reasons. As far as my thing goes, it's hard to tell what effect it has had. I have one person on my entire Patreon that's listed as fraud, which I believe is that situation where their bank did a chargeback, basically, or canceled the charge or something like that, and freaked out due to the change. It's one of these things where, basically, by the way, I'm not playing right now because I'm looking at my Patreon to talk about this, but I'm not showing that on the screen because that's just everybody's email addresses and shit like that. But there was this whole thing where, because they moved, banks are freaking out and like trying to stop the charges because they think that it's a bad thing, and so some of them are like charging back and stuff like that, and that leads to bad happening. There are also several declined charges, and some of them are just people. I think a decent number of them are just people that just have been declined in general in the past too. I think it's just a case of, like, some people get outdated credit card information, or their credit card goes bad, and like it just doesn't work on the Patreon. A lot of them are people they used to work, because I can see the balance of how much they've given me in the past, but they've been declined, and some of them have been declined for a while now, just every time it charges. I assume it's just people not updating their credit card information. You guys don't have to worry about that specifically, because those people have already not been counting towards my total. Patreon changed it a while ago that our total that shows up on our Patreon's front page is how much we make, not how many people are pledged. It used to be how many people are pledged, but all of the people who... information doesn't work and are declined and stuff like that would inflate that number artificially, and then Patreon's cut is a part of it, and like there's a few other little elements there. So they made the number more accurate. I think that was also like a year or two ago. They made the number more accurate, so it tells you how much I actually do make, or at least it's how much I made last time, plus or minus the number of changes and pledges since then, and any of the new pledges could turn out to be people whose cards are declined or whatever. But, you know, it's collectively it's more accurate at the very least. I might send a message to all the people whose cards get declined and just sort of kickstart them. I feel bad about it because a lot of them are people who have given me money in the past, some of them considerable amounts, and they just at some point their cards started being declined, and on some it's like feels weirdly needy and demanding to be able to like kick them and be all like, hey, where's my money? But also when they've already given me money, considerably more than 99% of all of my viewers. But at the same time, I probably should be proactive about this shit. And also, in many cases, these people probably are intending to give me money. So, you know, like, going back and, like, letting it allow to, like, a lot of them will just be, like, probably aghast to find that it hasn't been working this whole time or something, because they weren't paying attention. And, I probably should have spoken up sooner. I don't know. There's so many complicated feelings about everything all the time, and I get in my own head plenty. First question is from Ryan Scheel. What's your least favorite game you've actually completed, and why? Oh boy. Also, I'm supposed to go to the Darkwood and the monastery. Okay. This is a little hard. It reminds me of, I think when I was with Andrew, we had the, a question that was asking us, like, what is our favorite Let's Play? And it's hard not to think about just, like, how hard that is of a question to answer, just because we've been at this since 2011, and there's just so goddamn many, which makes it a whole lot harder to actually pick one out from the crowd. And so, but I guess it's on some level, like, the ones that come to mind quickly very well might be, they very well might be there specifically because I guess that, you know, more emotional reaction and stuff like that. So I should probably just say the first thing that comes to mind. And the first thing that comes to mind is Anima, Gate of Memories, just being the worst goddamn game. Like, shockingly bad. Its story was a nightmare. Its voice acting was bad, its jokes were bad, and it thought its jokes were really funny, you could tell. Its story actively contradicted itself and largely didn't make sense. Its combat was basically unplayable. Every single fight felt wrong. I kind of gave it a little bit more rope to hang itself with, because at first I was like, you know, maybe this is just a not great first impression, and it'll, like, improve over time, and I'm gonna give it a chance. And the more I played it, the more I resented the game, and it just kept getting worse. It wants to be like a cool, action-adventure, difficult game, not action-adventure, like character-action game. It's trying to be like some kind of Devil May Cry or Bayonetta, or maybe not even that. Just something that involves, like, lots of rapid dashing around and dodging, but also doing cool combos and fighting big bads and stuff like that. It feels vaguely like it's trying to be a character action game, but it had... First of all, its combat just felt garbage. Like, it felt astonishingly bad. Every combo most of the combos didn't feel right. The health balance between you and the enemies were bizarre, and the damage values all felt wrong, and an attack would come at you and you would know it was coming, and you'd hit the dodge button and you'd set it all up right, and just like all these weird, there'd be all these weird inconsistencies, and a lot of the skills, and just felt like they weren't working correctly, and just it was just a weird amateur mess that was just really unsatisfying to play. And it has some really baffling apologists, but a lot of the time people are just like, oh no, this is a disaster. And I remember at least one commenter was somebody who knew about the source material, which I think was a tabletop game, and they were like, oh no, what have they done to Anima? Because they cared about Anima, and this was not what they would hope for from an adaptation of Anima. It was just a real shit show. But the biggest, toughest train wreck of the whole thing was its difficulty. Because when a game has a bad combat, and I'm actually going to draw a direct comparison to the game that this game wants you to draw a comparison to. Because while its combat was like other things, the #1 game this game wanted to be was Nier. Not Nier Automata, which didn't exist yet. Or Automata, or whatever. No, I think it's Automata. Yeah. not near automata, but near Gestalt / near replicant, or as Americans and so on know it as just near, but it has two different versions, and we got near Gestalt, and I like to call it near Gestalt, if for no other reason than to differentiate it from near automata, because it's a cooler name than near one, basically. So I like to call it near Gestalt, and I named my series that, and mistakenly called my character Gestalt, which was a mistake. I was thinking Pokemon Red, Pokemon Blue, right? Where the character, when in those games the protagonist is actually named Red or Blue. Or I think they're just called Red, and Gary's name is Blue or something, I don't know. Whatever. Well, my point being that when there's different versions of a game in Japanese, sometimes the protagonist is named after the game, or the game's named after the protagonist or whatever. So I was like, I'll call my character Gestalt. That was a mistake. But, one thing that Nier... So I like Nier a lot. I like Nier more than I like Nier Automata. In part because I like the way it handles its characters and story a lot more. Which means more for me, because I didn't like either Nier's combat that much. I can easily point to Automata being an improvement over Nier Gestalt in combat department, but I still found it to be kind of floaty and mindless and not as engaging as even most games by the same developer, because that developer normally makes much more interesting combat games, but it seemed to be their attempt at making a Western style RPG with like very blah combat. So like it had some moves to it and it was flashy and responsive and stuff, but it just didn't seem... I would need... It's been too long since I played the game, so I'm trying to go into detail about it now is not going to be as helpful. But yeah, at the time, I just wasn't entirely pleased with the combat, and I was like, this is passable, but I wouldn't keep playing for the sake of combat, which is why I was kind of turned off by there being an entire DLC that's just about to being an arena mode, because I'm like, no, more combat's not what I'm in for, thank you. But I really like Nier's story, and I did not like Nier's combat, when I'm saying Gestalt this time, and... The main benefit I think Gestalt had is that it had bad combat, but its combat was easy. So it was bad combat, but it was bad combat that was easier to not notice. You could just fall into the spectacle of fighting your weird, wacky, crazy-ass boss that generated as it screams things at you that have story relevance, and you're like, what does this mean? I'm fighting her grandma, and her grandma's a weird monster attacking a village, this is crazy! And you could just, oops. And you could just get into that, and then just have some little exciting fights, but not really demanding fights. Like, oh man, that's a bunch of projectiles on the screen, I better dodge those, and ooh, hit him in its big weak spot. Like, it was I would kind of compare it to some of the Zelda games, because I think Zelda doesn't have great combat either, aside from Breath of the Wild. A lot of the combat's kind of especially like specifically the sword play. Zelda hides behind the fact that it has a bunch of gimmicky items, and that makes the bosses more interesting, but as far as the actual process of fighting a guy with a sword, it's generally not very interesting. And so Nier had a similar level of quality, in my opinion, to its sword play stuff, but was able to hide behind more spectacle. You had big flashy attacks, and weird, wacky, crazy bosses would come in, and they'd usually die before you could get bored with them, and you just kind of have some fun with it. And it's the glaring flaws in its combat system would largely go not unnoticed, but they wouldn't actively hinder the experience, and that's part of why I was able to enjoy the game so much. That is not the case for Anima Gate of Memories, which, for those that don't know, it's a Let's Play on this channel. This was done in Let's Play combat. You can hear my defeated, sad voice as I just get incredibly unhappy playing that game, but I'm like, I'm gonna fucking beat it. I'm gonna do this. I think I might have even turned the game down to easy mode or something, and it was still shockingly hard. And not in good ways. Not in, like, Dark Souls ways. And this comes down to also, like, one of those things about, like, was I talked recently to Wander and everyone during a stream about this idea that, like, I like Dead or Alive, but I get the feeling I don't like Dead or Alive for the same reason other people like Dead or Alive, and I like I like Dark Souls, but I often get the feeling I don't like Dark Souls for the reason other people like Dark Souls. Because me, I like Dark Souls because it has a really good combat system and good level design and so on. And I like Dead or Alive because it's just a really fun fighting game with an emphasis on counters and predicting your opponent and using the environment against your opponent. And also I like 3D fighting games more than 2D fighting games, specifically because of how they interact with the environment specifically and all that. So whenever something's hard, people will throw in my face that you like Dark Souls, that means everything hard gets a free pass forever regardless of context. But no, Anima's fucking butt hard for stupid reasons, and it's bad. It's really bad. And one of the biggest reasons is the fact that, like, no matter what you do, it seems, you just die in like 2 hits. Like, immediately. And meanwhile, the enemies seem to die in like 10 minutes of constantly hitting them. Like, it's astonishing. And I'm talking about the boss fights mostly. I don't remember how the normal enemies were handled. I think that I remember them being kind of spongy and also good at hurting you, but not at the scale of boss fights, obviously. But at the very least, like, the game, like, you could, you know, go from one to the other, and I think if you died, you would, like, respawn in the previous room and just kind of go with it. Whereas, like, it wasn't as much of a setback, so it wasn't as agonizing. But when you died against a boss, you have to start the whole boss fight over, and it was incomprehensible how incredibly durable the boss fights were. Like, you would just wail on them for like 10 minutes, and they could kill you in like 2 hits, and that's just terrible. Because like, once you get to those kinds of numbers, mathematically, I don't think there's such thing as a good boss fight that's like that. Like, I don't think there's a version of that time scale and that damage difference that is good in any game, frankly. I think that's beyond the pale. Like, that's... like, those kinds of numbers just generally don't work and don't make any sense. So that's... we're already starting at a bad spot there. But, like, the enemies would have flashy, ridiculous, sometimes screen-spanning attacks that are virtually undodgeable at times. And so, like, all these variables combined lead to a situation where you're basically trapped in a situation where you're just going to have to cheese every fight. You're going to find a way to manipulate the AI and avoid them attacking you correctly, or bait them into the same very dodgeable attack forever, because the moment they do the other scary thing, they're going to obliterate you, and then you have to start the 10-minute fight over and over again. Or, like, figure out just any trick you can to just avoid combat during the boss fight, essentially. Which, I remember the fights being surprisingly cheesable, and you just had to deal with that, but that only made the fights even longer, even on the easiest difficulty. And as far as I could tell, the difficulties were just a matter of the numbers changing, which is always not great difficulty anyway, because it's just boring to have difficulty measured by the fact that, like, they just change the numbers and the game otherwise stays the same. It's much more interesting when, like, a game like Metro actually poses the idea of changing enemy behavior or changing actual rules of the game to adapt, to make it more difficult and more interesting on some level, instead of just making the numbers crazier, especially when easy mode already has crazy numbers. I remember a bit of this happening with the Fall of the Dungeon Guardians also, as just being a game where I was like, the numbers felt insane, and making the game easier, I was still shocked by how demanding the numbers in the game were. I think that's one of the rare games I beat, in addition to Anima, on easy mode, and it was because I was like, why does everything... what are these numbers? And in a game all about numbers. But Anima was just... blah. There was one good fight. There was one, like, Ikaruga style fight, I remember, where you fight against some little boy, and he's doing... I think he's doing, like, light and dark style attacks. And it's a game where you can switch between a light and dark character, basically. So there was Ikaruga stuff going on, where which element you were affected, which projectiles would hurt you, and that made and overall the fight was just so much more enjoyable and interesting than the entire remainder of the game. Unfortunately, that was like 15 minutes of a playthrough that was like 40 episodes long, so that's not a really good ratio, as it turns out. I thought I was supposed to find a tower in this place. What the fuck? But yeah, the game was brutal, and it's irredeemable. There was no positive qualities about it aside from maybe its art style, but even that was that was reduced a bit in and validity and value or whatever the fuck in the fact that every single cutscene was freeze frames, which is really awkward for telling your story. The voice acting was not only was the voice acting bad, but the voice recording was bad. Like, it was incompetently done, where like there was like clipping in the audio, and like the actual audio was bad, which was not a great sign. Which I mean, the way that voice acting tends to work, right, is that they hire a bunch of voice actors online, and then they send them the lines, and those people send in recordings, and you coach them, and so on. So like, I guess that's just what they got from that person, and that's the quality that person had. But it's real unfortunate. I wonder whether they just didn't, like, did they fail to catch the audio quality problems and just not notice because they're not audiophiles or something, even though I'm not really an audiophile, although I do work with this stuff, so I notice some things that other people don't. There's been so many goddamn times where I've walked in on oh shit, the black marsh beyond the dark wood. This is what happens when I fucking try to multitask. It's fine. This what I'm doing right now is not that important in the game. We're just grinding. But I noticed that I know some audio quality things that a lot of people don't notice, because I'll come in on like Wander streams and notice that he's clipping or something's wrong with the audio balance, and I'm like, how is nobody bringing up the fact that you can't hear him over the video game? He's been streaming for an hour, and no one in the audience was like, hey, the audio balance is fucked up and this video is unwatchable. It's weird how often that happens. So maybe people just didn't notice. I don't know. Or just don't think to speak up. I don't remember what was wrong with the story, but it was agonizing. I was furious at the story by the end of the game, because it was just actively not making sense, and it was just a big pain. I remember one big part was just the fact that the entire premise of the game was that the devil that you're sharing a body with is this evil mega demon that threatened the entire world and was such a problem that he had to have an entire shrine dedicated just to keeping him held away. I forgot to check my inventory before I started today's session, so there's a bunch of garbage I should have filtered out of by now, and whoops. I should probably hold on to that for selling purposes. I remember there being a big mess where, like, the story just was, like, the whole game was about keeping this demon held prisoner, and then fucking after a whole game of knowing that, if you do the ending where he gets freed, because there's a whole bunch of endings, everyone's like, oh my god, how could he betray us? It's so tragic. And it's like, and it's not even the main character that does it. Because if the main character was like, how could he betray us? Then I'd be like, okay, well, yeah, you freed him because you thought you could trust him. Like, you convinced yourself it was okay to trust him, so I get that. But no, it was like a different character who was not you, whose entire job was basically specifically to keep this exact character imprisoned forever because of a problem they were. And they are the ones who imprisoned them in the first place, specifically because of that issue. And, it's like, you knew he was a bad guy. That's why you made this entire place. How can you be surprised he betrayed us when you let him go in that particular ending? And, like, the thing is, you have to, like, do other shit where you get specific endings where you've, like, you win his trust and his friendship, and then when he goes free, he'll actually help you. But, like, there was no in-universe explanation for why this authority figure would whose entire job is to keep this one guy at bay because he's such a villain, would be like, how could he betray us when you let him free, when there was no indication that she would even think that he was on your team. There's bizarre bad endings. There's a lot of Virtue's Last Reward actually going on, where, like, there's just a variety of endings and choices that just don't make sense. Like, Virtue's Last Reward is full of moments where it's like, you can betray somebody as Sigma, and Sigma will be like, I don't know what came over me. Even I can't explain why I made that choice. And then the game will just end in a nonsensical, like, game over anyway, with no real story being revealed. And I'm like, why did that choice exist, game? It contradicts the protagonist's entire decision-making process and character. It's a completely out-of-character move, and it doesn't give us any new information, which is the whole point of playing every path in Virtue's Last Reward, and it artificially pads the game even further. And it's like, I have issues with the fact that that game lets you choose ally or betray every single time, regardless of context, because there's so many times in that game where Sigma would never choose ally, or would never choose ally, or never choose betray, or whatever. The ally is usually an option, but there's a lot of situations where he has no in-character reason to betray somebody, and would definitely not betray somebody. And it's kind of cute when they let Junpei get every choice in the previous game, just because of the fact that, like, you know, it was a much shorter game, so it's kind of like, yeah, right. But by the time you get to Sigma, and there are like 50 choices, and the spreadsheet of the flowchart of the game is like infinitely long, I'm like, you know what, we don't need to see every possible permutation. Like, if there's no story to be provided and it's out of character choice, then maybe let's just not have that one then, you know? I mean, far be it for me to remove choices from a video game generally, because I think that video games should have choices, and that's like the point. I mean, when you have a role-playing game or a game that's about choices on any level, like a visual novel, but Virtue's Last Reward is specifically a game that's not about choices, because you have to do every choice in order to finish the game, basically. So filler choices are pointless, and also the concept of choice doesn't apply to that game, because you're just going to click on every single option anyway, so there actually are no choices in the entire game, and the only real gameplay is the puzzle rooms, because otherwise you're just pressing A until the entire flowchart fills in on its own, and then just having the story happen at you. But that's a story for another day, like when somebody asks about that game again. But yeah, the story was a shit show, the combat was a shit show. I've talked long enough at this point. I think, yeah, you guys can go check out the Let's Play if you want more context, but yeah, anima, not anime, it's spelled like anime, but with an A at the end, replacing the E, not after the E. It has like no redeemable qualities, and the sequel has come out. I think amusingly, in a strong case of just knowing that the developer did not, or PR company did not watch my coverage of the game, because they gave me a code for it when I played it. I know they never watched it, because when the sequel came out, because there's a sequel now, they sent me the PR circuit email where you can like potentially request a code and stuff like that, and I'm like, wow, they did not watch my coverage of their game if they're offering to give me the second one, even in a roundabout way where I have to ask for it first, because I'm not the coverage they want. It will not go over well. Ryan Richter asks, have you considered changing your Patreon goal? It seems that for the last few years it has been at the $500 mark, and by now it's more than doubled. Whatever your Patreon page overview is open, that goal is shown very clearly to have been completed, which to an unfamiliar viewer would suggest that your current needs are met. While that may be essentially true, you are of course trying to progress beyond your basic necessities to greater things. So that would be a perfect opportunity to set a new goal. From a prospective patron's perspective, patron's perspective. You did that on purpose. This would shift their pledge from being an overflow of a long past goal towards being someone who is helping a creator reach a new milestone. Basically, it would make it feel like the additional support would actually be going somewhere. What are your thoughts on this? I think you're completely correct, basically. My problem is, and it's probably just me getting in my own head again and shit like that, as I do. So I should really have summons, shouldn't I? I'm sure I'll double check my stats later. I get jumpy about that stuff. I get in my own head about demanding things without context, or making not context, without something to back it up, basically. Or how do I put this? Like, a while ago, Wanderbot had a Patreon goal, and one of his Patreon goals was, he just threw in there this idea of, like, moving to Seattle and subsidizing, Keith moving, there, doing the same. Like, the idea was that he was promising, because he put it in there, he's essentially promising to his audience, not only am I going to move to Seattle, but I'm going to pay for Keith to do it the same thing. And I think it was like some number that was not reasonably going to get reached anyway, because it was both a large number, and also it was a thing where like Wander doesn't have much support on crowdfunding locations. He gets support on Twitch and also has a significantly larger audience, so he makes more money on ads and everything, so he's fine. But he does not, he's never done well on Patreon or any of the crowdfunding things, for a few reasons it might be. One is he doesn't follow through on like really making any sort of Patreon like feature. Like he's never had a Patreon series the way that I have. So there's no ongoing incentive to check it out. And in addition to that, it might, on some level, it might have to do with the fact that he has a younger audience, and younger people have less money on average, so me making my more boring content with all these CRPGs and puzzle games and whatnot attracts what's likely an older audience, point-and-click adventure games. And those people are more likely to actually have some sort of disposable income, so that might be on some level why I have more Patreon support. But there's also the fact that I have an ongoing Patreon series, and I have Patreon credits at the end of every video, which helps with like make it visible to people. Whereas I imagine a lot of people that know about Wander don't even know he has a Patreon, because I don't think he makes it visible enough in general. My one thing I kind of pride myself on is that I do get a vague sense at times that I might be doing everything right on Patreon, and some of the other people I know might be doing kind of everything wrong on some level, which is not meant to be like an indictment, but just sort of a bit of a reality of the outcome on some level. What could I jam into there? Sure. A little kind of half-assing this a little bit. I'm not trying to rag on Wanderbot here. He does a lot of other shit right, apparently, because he definitely makes more money than I do from this entire enterprise, and has a wildly successful channel by our standards. But that's just the one thing that hasn't panned out for him, and he's clearly just chosen to focus his energies elsewhere. Whereas I've gone all in on this partly out of survival mechanism, really. But I've always been shocked by, and I've always been shocked by and felt somewhat undeserving of, like, the crazy Patreon following I get, because it's always been significantly larger than any other channel my size, but also, like, I can compare my Patreon following to that of significantly larger channels, and very often I will pretty much exclusively every single time I have a disproportionately large following if I like do the math to figure out proportionally how my channel compares to theirs. But in many cases I'll look at the Patreon of somebody that has 300,000 or 400,000 subscribers, and I will be already beating them or tied with them on, like, in terms of, like, the amount of support on Patreon, which is shocking to me. And I feel very thankful, and, like, I don't want to fuck that up, and that's why part of the reason why I'm always hesitant to ask for more and things like that, or heavily advertise it beyond the normal stuff, is because I'm like, it's part of my livelihood, but also, like, I already am getting more than people normally do at my size, and I don't want to start, I don't know, something equivalent of selling out or whatever. It's not really selling out in that case. I don't think that's an applicable term, but, you know, I have a livelihood that depends entirely on the court of public opinion, and that can be scary at times. And so I always get jumpy about, like when I talk about, like, I think I mentioned before that when I launched the Patreon in the first place, I need water. When I launched the Patreon in the first place, I was, like, staying up, and, like, I just could not get to sleep because I was just stressing over the idea, because that if you say the wrong thing or make the wrong move, then everyone can kind of turn against you, and I'm just worried about that kind of stuff. And it's not necessarily fair to the people that are actually supporting me to think these kinds of things, but it's also I think a somewhat reasonable fear, especially since being overly concerned about this stuff is better than being under concerned about stuff like this. Like, we have instances of people like, was it James Gunn's entire livelihood changing as a result of the fact that, like, he said certain things in the past and stuff like that, or we have stuff like the Fine brothers becoming so detached from reality and public perception and so on that they just say completely insane things and propose completely nonsensical business things and say it in the most, just say it in the worst possible way too for what they were trying to do, and just like have everybody turn on them. And I don't think of myself as doing those kinds of things, but I think that being more careful and cautious and worried about going into that kind of territory helps me avoid that problem and so on. I'm kind of self-moderating, basically. Let's see.
I'll put that to good use.
It might be better. I don't know. No, I'll probably sell that. All those gems do add up. Let's go back to town. But on some level, I'm just jumpy about being demanding or becoming a worse person and stuff, and I don't want to do that just because whenever people get financial support and fame or anything like that, they have a tendency to become garbage people, and I don't understand how that happens, and so I don't want... So, because I don't fully understand what causes it, I'm afraid of falling victim to things that I don't fully understand. All that stuff. I think it's reasonable fears, even if they're not directly applicable to my actual situation in many cases. I think it's probably a good thing that I worry about it, or something. But that's more or less the situation. And so that's why I recoil away from these kinds of things a bit, is I don't want to become... I don't want to ever, like, fail to check myself when I need to. And so, to circle back, because I'm kind of off topic here, and I'm not fully reinforcing my original point properly, but I'm getting into side thoughts that are related, but not really what we were talking about. I want my goals to be backed up by something. And so my original goals were... I think the first one was to have $100, and that my goal there wasn't necessarily the money value. It was that I wanted a certain number of supporters, and that was because the reward was going to be to have a Patreon chosen series. That was the $100 landmark, and that was mainly because of the fact that I couldn't say that at least at the time, it wasn't a feature. You couldn't say, my goal is to have this many patrons. It was to have this much money. And so I figured, I just kind of roughed out some idea of how many patrons I wanted to have, and just made it to a dollar value based on that I thought might be applicable. And it was kind of undercut by the fact that some people then immediately pledged very large amounts of money. And I was like, oh, fuck, that screws up my whole original math premise. Whoops. But the reason for that was because I wanted to do the whole Patreon nomination and voting series thing, and in order to do that, what I wanted to do was have a certain number of people so that the poll would actually, you know, be populated by nominators and voters and stuff like that, which back then, the nominators and voters were the same people, and there was a rule that you couldn't vote for your own game in order to make it so that this could work at all. That was the original idea, and that was the reason for the $100 value. The $500 value was basically based around the idea of, like, I have X amount of income, my rent costs this much, and my costs of living are somewhere around this here and there. And basically, my goal was to make Patreon replace my income from my job. And then the hope would be that also my YouTube income would also be increasing on its own, but that's less controllable and less visible and so on. So my milestone was to just get to a point where I could, you know, go full-time. So my goal was to set an applicable amount of monthly income from Patreon that was comparable to how much I was making for my job, because then I could reasonably quit my job and focus on this full-time. So that was why the $500 value exists. The problem is it's hard to come up with other things that aren't just making up numbers, or things where I'm promising something. And I don't know if I fully fleshed out the Wanderbot concept before, or either earlier, but my idea there was that, like, my problem with him making that promise is he was saying that he was going to subsidize me going to Seattle, and I was uncomfortable with the fact that he was making a public promise essentially on sorry, he's essentially making a public promise on my behalf. And for me, I'm like, no, don't make a promise that involves me on your crowdfunding thing, because you can't make promises that involve other people that aren't like a part of your like company or something. Because I can't promise that I will do this exact thing that you just happened to thought up one day. And the reason why he had it listed was probably because he just didn't really consider it being a potential problem that he was promising something on my behalf, because he probably just didn't take it seriously or whatever, and it wasn't a big deal. But in my head, I'm like, no, because I care about whether or not the thing that is being said happens and not like that, and I don't want to betray people or go back on promises and stuff like that. So when a thing is promised, like, that's a thing to me. So I don't want other people making promises for me. And so that bothered me, and I like asked him to take it down, because I'm like, no, you can't do that. And he might have taken it the wrong way or something. I don't know how things went on his end with that. But I was like, you can't make promises about what I'm going to do, because even if all the money exists, that's just the specifics of moving to Seattle is not necessarily a thing that I can fully promise. There's so much research to be done and life choices to be made, and probably like a trip to Seattle where I actually like try to figure out what it's like to live there and whether I'm comfortable there and other stuff like that. Like there's so many steps between me and being comfortable with moving to a specific place, in addition to also just monetary reasons, where I'm like, the idea of somebody making crowdfunding on my behalf, that kind of specific promise, is like something I'm not psyched about. But that's the wander thing I was saying before. So if I come up with additional goals, I'm not super sure what to do. I understand on some level people might just not care, but on some level also I don't want to promise something that I won't necessarily do. I could probably just come up with dumb flavor text, and that might be the avenue I go with, because I've been thinking about this a little bit too. Like, I should probably have a goal just to drive forward momentum, and so I might just have dumb fluffy descriptions like $10,000 a month, haha, set for life, and stuff like that, where it's like, because I mean that's more or less true. If that does happen, it's like, well, I guess I'm all set now. look at all the money I'm making, isn't that great? And I might come up with somewhat comical ones in a few different tiers like that, but the fact that I don't have numbers right now is my current sort of problem, I suppose, is that I don't have very, very, very specific prospects in mind of like, here is my budget, and here's the place I plan on moving to, and here's exactly what I need to hit as my monthly income, you know, plus a margin of error for safety reasons. Like that kind of math, that was the original motivation behind the 500, is not there. And so that's why I'm more jumpy about the idea of setting another goal. But I probably will, because it almost certainly does help outward appearances to convey the fact that, like, hey, donations are still good. I'm definitely not, like, set for life because I hit 500. Let's see. We'll just stand in town for this one because I think this is going to be a really short one. Mitch asks, I'm wondering if I could ask for free crypto coins every time I donate. I heard from friends that URL redacted gives free coins to YouTubers and their patrons. I really hope you'll add that as one of your perks. I removed the URL because I don't know if this is a weird, like, undercover approach to, like, is this an attempt at, like, marketing? The fact that the moment they subscribed, they immediately were posing this, it almost feels like they could almost be, like, as somebody who works on YouTube and gets comments like, hey, nice video, glad I'm a big fan, do this thing for me, check out my channel, play my indie game, all these other things. Like, I'm so used to people, like, pretending to be fans to then get something out of me that I'm warning flags go up immediately for this one. And I don't know. But it says, I heard from friends that URL gives free coins to YouTubers and their patrons. I really hope you'll add that as one of your perks. So, sorry if this is a false flag and I'm just, like, calling you out when you're just a real person and you just sound a lot like a bot and so on. But if you are a real person, you probably shouldn't be supporting people on Patreon for the purpose of then in turn getting a monetary gain, like it's an investment that you're going to make back. That's not really the premise. That's not really like the point of any of this, really, to be honest. I don't know what you're talking about, and I have not looked into it, but I probably won't, because it kind of just sounds like, I don't know, everything about it sounds completely fishy, like it's going to be some vague thing that screwed, like if you don't just make free money, generally speaking, so like some part of this is probably screwing somebody over in some part of the process, or it might be some kind of pyramid scheme or something, I don't know. But yeah, no, I'm not going to pay people to be my patrons. That's bizarre, and I also have no interest in cryptocurrency across the board. Mahasamatman asks, how does Vampyr, or Vampyr, I thought I was free of this game's name. I'm gonna call it Vampyr, fuck it. It's just a cooler name than Vampire, but then it's the one with the Y in the name. How does Vampyr compare to other games you are currently playing and Western RPGs you've played? How does it compare to vampire stories you know? Vampire the Masquerade counts. What would you change about it to make it a better game/story? So right off the bat, I will say that I am not an aficionado of vampire stories. So I don't have a lot to provide there, unfortunately, as far as like takes on how good it is at that. I actually have trouble thinking of vampire stories in general, but especially since the ones I grew up watching are the shitty ones. I am most exposed to the vampire stories that are like basically just shitty mid-2000s action movies that happen to feature vampires. I'm thinking the Hugh Jackman Van Helsing or the Underworld series and other things where it's like these are all like somewhat uninteresting post-Matrix like grim, flashy, combat flourishy action movies that happen to feature vampires, especially Underworld. Underworld exclusively exists as a franchise in the form it took, at least, because of the Matrix, all the way down to women in dark, like, leather/rubbery tights, doing all that shit. It's very on the nose. And that's a lot of stuff. Equilibrium, like a bunch of stuff in the 2000s existed in the form that it did exclusively because people saw the Matrix and it did well. So a lot of stuff then had to look like the Matrix for like a decade, because Hollywood executives are very creative people with original visions and definitely don't just make whatever decision they think will make them money. Haha. So I don't have a lot to draw on for vampire stuff, but on some level there's supposed to be some kind of metaphor in many cases where it's like, oh, the vampire is like, it's like man, but it's like, this is about a class struggle and so on, and like there's a little bit of that at times in Vampyr. In fact, calling the game Vampyr will actually help me not confuse this conversation, actually, so that's handy. In that game, Jonathan Reed is a very wealthy, aristocratic doctor character in a society that seems to be filled with the have-nots, and they're all struggling with the plague. And so some of that is there and accounted for. On a regular basis, the person who is a vampire is an aristocrat and somebody who's well-to-do, in part because it helps them have a lair that they can go to, but also because that's just, I think that's just the part of the metaphor that resonates. Just, it's like, kind of like having a zombie apocalypse where you hole up in a mall. Like, there's certain combinations of visuals and themes that resonate more because they speak to something that is tied to reality, even if a lot of the audience may not even be actively thinking about that. A powerful, rich vampire is more interesting than a vampire that is just some asshole, basically. And some of that goes, there's other versions of vampire stories, I suppose, that go into that a little bit. There's is Daybreakers what it's called? There's a Ethan Hunt vampire movie, I think, which is also kind of one of these silly vampire things that, but it at least has an interesting theme going on, which is that its vampires have taken over the world, and now all the remaining humans are basically cattle now. They're being used as... This is gonna be one of those things where I think, I'm like, I don't know vampire stories, and then I'm gonna find out that I know a lot of vampire stories that I'm gonna remember all of a sudden, aren't I? It's gonna be like that first conversation about humanity, about work ethic or whatever. in the Ethan Hunt story, Daybreakers, humanity has already lost. There's a resistance force that you kind of follow up with in the main narrative, but by and large, society has already fallen. Humans are blood banks now. They're kept alive in facilities where they just are used to grow blood forever, more or less. And, you know, vampires don't necessarily need the blood to survive, but they, you know, they constantly hunger for it, and they thrive when they have it or something. They might have needed to survive in that story, I don't remember actually. It varies so heavily, this mythos of this fictional character, because, you know, vampires aren't real. Or are they? But that's at least that's a twist that's interesting. It's not just a rich aristocrat in some European country who takes advantage of women, seduces them, and then feeds on them, and then moves on to the next one. Instead, they've already taken over, and they are abusing the human race and using them as chattel and cattle. And I think that speaks to what works in a vampire narrative, is there being some kind of class divide of some sort. Because that's not the same one that normally exists, but it is something. Humans are slaves, they are cattle, and the vampires run society. So once again, the vampires are a thing that is more powerful than the human for reasons other than being a vampire. They are societally more powerful than the humans, in addition to being more powerful than humans because they have superpowers and are immortal and other stuff like that. I think that is somewhat necessary to the narrative, and it's the right direction to go in for a lot of the stuff. I think Vampyr touches on this in two different ways, but I'm not entirely sure if it's in interesting ways. And in fact, I think sometimes it might even subvert these things in ways that I don't know if it was entirely helpful the way they did it. So Jonathan Reed is an aristocrat, so that is there, but I don't know if they did it because they understand why those narratives did it, or if they just did it because other narratives did it, and vampires are traditionally visually designed that way. Like, they're used to looking at a vampire and it being an aristocratic character on character design alone, and that might have been why Jonathan Reed is an aristocrat character in Vampyr, or it might have been just literally because he's a doctor and that's what doctors were like at the time, I believe. That might have also been why, because I don't get much feeling, aside from a little bit of lip service, that necessarily that game is interested in class divide and doing anything with it. In particular, because I don't think Jonathan Reed's powerful position in society is really actually utilized by the narrative in any way. Holy crap, that guy they just exploded. I don't think it did anything. Yeah, as far as I can remember, I don't think it really played a role in the story and really mattered all that much, which is a missed opportunity perhaps. And so I think having a more meaningful class divide might be more interesting. There's also the additional layer of scowls, which is, they took the class divide and they added it to the inside of the vampire mythos. They didn't come up with that necessarily, but I've seen it plenty in other places, like Strain. God damn it, that's another vampire story. It turns out I actually do know vampire stories. The Strain also had that division of sorts. But in this one, there's high vampires, and there's mega ultra ancient legendary vampires deluxe edition with like the holofoil card. And then there's the scowls, and the scowls are like almost zombies by vampire standards. They just kind of suck and aren't powerful and aren't pretty, and they live in the sewers and whatnot. And so there's an additional layer of class divide there. But once again, I don't think Vampyr does anything with that narratively. There is the sewer that has the scowls in it, the sewer scowls, as they're called, explicitly, and they live in the sewer, and they play almost no role in the narrative. Like, you're introduced to them at one point, and you get to tour their facilities for a bit, and then you leave, and then at the end of the game you find out that, spoilers, I guess, that they've been destroyed. And you're like, oh no, the sewer scowls. The people that were so developed and interesting in this narrative that I literally couldn't talk to them. Like, it's a game about societies where you go to 4 different communities and you meet the pillar of the community eventually, but on the way there, you meet everybody else in the community, And the whole point is that you, like, you know, get involved in this actual community where you meet everybody, and each one of them has like 20 characters or something like that, in addition to the pillar of the community, which is the person you're going to make a big major decision about, and that's going to affect the fate of the community. That gets you invested in their story and what's going to happen and so on some level. And then you get to this one. You reach I'm gonna go back to town because the server's about to restart apparently. You get to this one and then fucking nothing happens. You get to this community, you can't meet it, you can't talk to a single character besides the leader of the entire community. Like, you just can't talk to them. They just don't seem to count by this game's standards as real people. So there's no long conversations to have about the histories of individuals. You can't even talk to them at all, actually. There's no interpersonal relationships for you to manage like in every other community, and you can't influence what happens to them. They're actually tied to the narrative inextricably, and you can't separate them from that. So no matter what you do in the game, they will all be wiped out, and the pillar of their community will still be alive afterwards and be like, they might be like, you're a good person or you're a bad person for reasons not entirely related to what's happening here, and then you just kind of move on. It's a little weird. It's probably a stronger weapon, I think. Let's see, is this no, it's not going to be an improvement for you. Not getting great drops here, am I? Generally. So I think that was, like, the fact that even the game doesn't care about the skulls means I can't really be like, oh, see, there's a class divide that's interesting with them, and that means, like, that means something for the story, right? Because I as far as I can tell, the game just didn't care about the skulls all the way through, and they are never introduced as characters, and they unceremoniously are wiped out off camera, and you're like, alright. These characters had two scenes. The scene where you learn they exist, and the scene where they're established as now being dead. Okay. So that doesn't really go anywhere. Not to say that class divide is intrinsically mandatory for vampire stories, but it's something that even not very good movies usually can mine for some kind of narrative, like Daybreakers and so on. Oftentimes they can do something with that, and this game does not do anything with that, really, as far as I can tell. I don't think any of the characters' class struggles really affects the narrative, generally speaking. Mainly because, unfortunately, and this speaks to larger issues that are not a comparison to other media, but instead just an issue with internally within the game, is that Vampyr isn't really interested in weaving any of its characters into the main narrative. So it has a main story, and it has a sandbox full of side characters you can talk to for 5 minutes, and those and never shall the twain meet. So, like, the people that you're meeting in the main story never affect the people you meet in the main story are completely self-contained and largely non-interactive outside of the main story, and you just come up to them periodically to do the main story stuff. And the people in the side stuff are just weird content modules that you could just add to the game in a completely modular manner and then remove from the game, and the difference would not necessarily be noticed. And that's weird. Does this affect my slot count? Damn it. My bad. I want more slots on my belt. My belt's so shallow and shitty. Oh well. So, like, you will walk up to a character, talk to them for 5 minutes, hear their whole backstory, maybe unlock a few clues here and there, maybe give them some cold medicine if they have a cold, and then walk away, and you'll never see that character again. And it's really weird. And they never come up in the story, and the things you do in the main story aren't gonna, like, affect what happens to that character. Like, oh no, Jack died because I killed the person who runs Jack's barreling company and now he's out of work, or like, no. Almost never does anything happen. I think the main thing is that if you take out the very, very, very first pillar of the game, then this one guy is like, that works there, is like, now I'm over here and I'm not happy with you, and that's it. And I think that's the only time that it can affect the story. And even that one time was a moment where it's like, dude, he just chastises you for a second, but because he's not a character that matters in the main story, and was always a side one, the best you get is that one little piece of feedback of, that wasn't a nice thing you did, and I'm blaming you, even though I individually can't even actually tell you what you did because I don't know what you actually did, because I don't know you're a vampire. That whole thing that happened in my narrative. It's just really underdone. Across the board, I was really disappointed by the fact that the people in the main story and the people in the side content never interact or meaningfully, even when sometimes they seem to have meaningful relationships. Like you meet you meet the daughter of the secondary character, because the game kind of only has 3 main characters. It's you, the love interest, and the guy who runs the hospital you're staying at are like the only developed characters in the game that matter for the main narrative. Because unfortunately the main narrative also doesn't really have characters. Like McCollum is this vampire hunter, and you meet him early in the game where he just is like storming out of a room, and it's like, oh man, who's this antagonist? And then you basically never interact with McCollum ever again until one time he antagonizes you, like, I'm after you, Dr. Reed, like 10 hours later. And then another 10 hours later, you fight him in a boss fight. And then you make a decision that affects the final state he'll show up in. But, like, you don't have conversations with him very much or anything, or, like, he's not a developed character with interesting things to do. He's just a boss fight that's going to happen near the end of the game. And the game does, like, 1 or 2 scenes of setup just to establish that he exists, so that you can then, you know, be aware that he exists, so that when he does the fight, when you fight him later, at least it means something, which admittedly is more than some other boss fights get, because the time that he antagonizes you at the theater, you just finished fighting a boss you met in that scene. Like, you meet a character and you convince her that she should die, or that what she's doing is bad or whatever, and then you kill her all over the course of one conversation, and that's the first time you ever met her in the first place. And I'm like, what? That's like the boss fight of an entire chapter, and you just met her, which is also how the final boss fight is handled in that game. You just find out that they exist as a concept and then fight them, and they were the final boss of the whole game, and you're like, oh, that was important, apparently. Shit, it was all building up to this question mark? I don't know about that, but this is where it all led to, is how the narrative ends, is like a boss fight against a non-character that's just like a force of evil that a tiny bit of lip service was given to before, and that's about it. It's really underwhelming how they handle a lot of the stuff. Like, the whole game just lacks continuity and... Oops. I changed what... I didn't have my weapon equipped. The whole game just lacks connection. Nothing is attached to anything else. Things you do in one part of the narrative don't affect other parts of the narrative, so it all just feels entirely modular and like it goes nowhere. The only way, as far as I can tell, that the main narrative can even really directly affect the characters in the game is that if you kill enough random people or make cataclysmic choices with the pillar of a community, then you can end up in a situation where the entire community fails, which is that they have like a health bar as a whole, and if that health bar hits 0, then what I've been told happens is that every single character in the entire district goes missing, and then that's it. Like, they all go missing, the area is full of more monsters now than it was before, and you essentially lose that district, and, you know, you can probably just assume that they died, more or less, or functionally for the story they have at the very least. That's the only thing that can collectively happen that makes things in the game attached to other things. They're never attached for narrative reasons. Like, if you meet the daughter of your love interest, that never really comes up. You don't make decisions with one or the other that really affects each other, aside from the one decision that hangs over the head of every single side character in the entire game, which is that you can straight up murder people and drink their blood and become more powerful. And that is a cool decision to have, but the fact that it's the only decision you can make with any character is really underwhelming, because there should be more to it than that. There's more to it than that in every RPG, basically, because normally you make decisions in the dialogue or tell them one thing or another, or you can push them one way or another without, you know, being a vampire. Like, if somebody is doing an illicit behavior where they're selling hospital beds, like they're selling the hospital beds, so they're charging patients during a plague for the ability to even be in the hospital at all, and not like as a company or mandate or any sort of like logistical thing, but they just themselves are lining their pockets by charging the employees. Like, that's a bad thing, and you should probably try to stop it, right? But the only way to try to stop it is to murder them. It's not normal. It's not necessarily reasonable. And like, the game's going for one thing, which is that they want to give you a colorful cast of characters with a number of moral graieties. Some of them are completely horrible. Some of them are totally horrible, but their position makes them harder to touch, or they mean more to the community, so attacking them might be bad, even though you know that they're dark secret and how fucked up they are. Some of them have done bad things for arguably good reasons, or understandable reasons, and also the level of bad thing people have done is very all over the place. Overall, the cast of characters is not a thing I have a problem with, it's just how they're handled. Like, the stories behind a lot of these characters are interesting, and then a lot of the time I feel like they deserve a better game. But like, there should be more to it than just the question of whether or not you can kill them. Because yeah, the question is that the game is like posing this idea of like, you need to eat people because you're a vampire. So here's a colorful cast of characters with different motivations and backstories and crimes, so that you can now have to juggle like the thought like, oh, should I eat this person because they burn people alive, or this person that sells hospital beds, or this person who sells false cures for this plague, and stuff like that. In addition to the fact of like, there's also an additional layer of interesting variable that the area as a whole has like a health bar, and you're affecting that if you like overindulge on eating people. So even if you are being like a total psychopath about it and don't care about the reasons why someone deserves to die or not, you still have the reason to be like, well, these are my cattle, and if I wipe out the entire district, then I don't get any more food. Like there's a lot of interesting mechanical things going on there, but you can still let me try to do other things narratively with those characters besides just eating them or not eating them. Like, in the back of my head, in the back of my head, I can still be holding on to the fact that those people are willing to sell hospital beds, and consider that when I'm thinking about whether or not I should kill them in the future, even if I stop them from doing it. Like, they're still the person that would do that, and that still affects, like, the morality of my perception of them, even if I also stop them from doing that. But they don't let you stop them from doing that. You can't report them to their superiors, you can't threaten them to stop, you can't really do anything. You just know that they're doing it, and that's it. That's all that happens. And like, it's just really odd. Some of these characters have quests and some of them don't, but even when you encounter a quest for some of these characters, there's no choices in the quest. You can't be like, this is what I want them to do. It's just, no, it's just, that's it. You could just do the quest. You could not do the quest, I guess, but that's about it. So like, you get a quest about two doctors fighting over how to treat a patient, where one of them wants to do a more experimental thing, then one of them wants to do the safe thing, but there's also the argument that maybe the safe thing won't work, and the experimental thing might work, but the experimental thing might also be a risk, and it might be dangerous to the patient. But also, you could potentially learn something from the experiment that could help a lot of patients, in addition to this one. Like, there's a lot of variables going on there, and so you're like asked to balance this idea between like, what do you care more about, the code of a doctor to do no harm and to not risk their patients needlessly, or, you know, technological progress and the ability to save more people in the future. Like, these are questions worth posing, and it's something that should be posed as a question by the game, if it's going to take place in a hospital as its primary base, especially. Sure, it would be nice if you could answer that question yourself, but you don't get to. Nope. Instead, there's a quest where you're supposed to gather the resources for the guy doing the experiment, and then you go gather all the resources together and to make a thing for him to do the experiment with, and then I believe you basically just make a placebo, if I remember correctly, And I don't think it was even your choice as a player to make a placebo. I think, if I remember correctly, Jonathan just decides that that's the way he's going to go with it. And that's what happens. I changed my weapon again. I keep accidentally pressing W because that's the default hand position to be in while playing PC games. And then I change away from having a weapon. Then I notice because I'm moving so slowly. So correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you can't make a choice about which person to go with. You just appease them. You just do a weird awkward middle ground where you refuse to experiment on them, but you side with him to let him do the experiment, kind of, but not really, because what you actually do is I think you give them a placebo or some other thing that isn't actually the thing, and like you subvert the experiment instead of going through with it. So you as a player don't get, I don't think you get a choice to either play it safe and be ethical versus do the experiment and risk somebody's life. And then also the ending outcome of doing this quest is that you never talk to these characters again. Nobody comes back to tell you what happened, or like the patient never gets better. No time, because this is a game where no time passes, seemingly. So even when you explicitly pass time. So, like, there's a series of patients in that hospital and none of them get better. You can't make decisions that affect their fate outside of choosing to murder them. They all just hang out forever in their perpetual state of being patients at a hospital. And even the one that has a whole quest around him, he doesn't go anywhere. He has this whole plight where, like, by the way, you're experimenting on this guy who specifically is the breadwinner of their family. I don't think he has a wife. I think she might be dead or missing or something or whatever. But I think he has 2 daughters. And so, like, just to add to the level of moral gaiety for your decision, if they let you have one, is that in addition to all the other questions of whether you should experiment on people in order to progress society as a whole, it's a character who has children of their own. He has, I think, 2 children, and he's the only source of income, and so he's in a hurry to like, on one hand, you shouldn't do dangerous things with him, right? Because he has to go back to his family and take care of them. But on the other hand, I almost said morally bankrupt out of habit. They're financially bankrupt because he's not working right now, and he has to do manual labor, so he has to get back on his feet as fast as possible. So, like, maybe the experimental procedure could help him get on his feet faster, so so his children don't starve. Like, there's so many variables here to make the decision interesting, and then as far as I can remember, they don't give you a choice after setting up all these interesting variables. And I could be wrong about this specific case. I might be, I don't know, but I don't remember really any decisions in the game aside from the one you give to each pillar of the community. And this was admittedly at the very beginning of the playthrough, so it's a little hard to remember. But I can definitely say that consistently, the game sets up a variety of characters that have interesting scenarios around them. And then on a regular basis, the only way of interacting with them to make any kind of decision is to murder them. And so, in a way, I think that this game is continually held back by the fact that it even is about a vampire anything. Like, this very premise of being a vampire, like, story kind of undermines a lot of the more interesting things about it, because a different RPG would give you many more decisions about what to do in that kind of scenario, other than, do I do the murder or not? Because doing the murder or not is a really boring answer to that question, and there's much more interesting answers to be had. And oh, that's a yellow quality chess piece. But is it actually good? This isn't a great one to begin with, is it? These are not really very good items across the board. Whatever. Plop that in there. Just kind of burning through the stuff. So, like, any other RPG would have given you more interesting options in that kind of scenario, and many of the other scenarios, even if I'm wrong about that one, because on a regular basis, that game will just give you a colorful cast of characters and an interesting moral dilemma, and then not let you make a choice. And it's like, well, then what kind of video game is this? I thought that's why we have video games usually. Usually in an RPG, you get all that exposition thrown in your face that you can then make a change of some kind or make an informed choice. And instead of what you're doing basically is you just listen to a bunch of people complain about their job, and you can't even support them on Patreon. It's like, even when I complain at length about my job, it's with the background detail of, like, and there's a way that you can affect this. On some level, but even then, like, complaining about jobs is, you know, a normal human behavior on some level. But like when it happens in a video game, and it also makes up the bulk of the content, not being able to interact with it is super weird. It's just super weird, and also it's like moral simplicity. It's weird because they know to set up scenarios that are morally dubious and questionable, but then your interaction with them is not nearly as nuanced as the situation itself often is, because you have a binary choice. Do I murder this person or not? And that's like, it's super weird. I would forgive this perhaps if they really leaned into the vampire thing. Because if you were a vampire that has to feed on people, which I assume at some point must have been what they wanted to, what they planned on making or thought about making, because the first thing that happens in the game is you immediately murder your sister. Unfortunately, the sister's not a developed character that you know, so it's, you don't really know what to feel about that right out the gate necessarily, aside from just the generic feeling of, you know, a person murdering their family member. But like the moment the game starts, you're like, I'm waking up as a vampire. I murdered my sister. Like, the first thing you do is, like, you're in a blood haze, you can't tell where you are or what's going on, and you bite someone, and you have to. You can't not do it. And then after you recover from your haze, you're like, oh no, that was my sister, I just murdered my sister, that's not a good thing to do. Shit. And then that comes up later when your sister turns out to be a vampire, and you kill your sister, and again, and so on, which, you know, better follow-up than nothing, but still. But the fact that you murder your sister out the gate, like, that sets up this narrative where you are a vampire who, like, will go into this blood rage where you have to feed if you don't feed for too long. And then the game doesn't do that. And I'm like, why? Because that's such a better game. That's such a better game. Because then it's like Pathologic or whatnot, where you just have meters that you have to deal with. And so, like, in Pathologic, you're taking... you have to deal with a reputation meter, a life meter, a hunger meter, an exhaustion meter, an immunity meter, and like a infection meter. It's like two of those are about the plague itself, which is how resistant you are to the plague and how sick you are right now. That's a problem. But then you also have exhaustion, like you have to go to sleep at certain times, or take something to push back your exhaustion, or you'll be in trouble. You need your health to not die. You need to eat food. Because you're a human, and so on. And you need a reputation, because if your reputation goes down, then the people in the open world can start attacking you. It's like, those are a bunch of interesting variables that you have to balance against each other, right? In Vampire, there's none of those. In Vampire, they set up the idea that it's going to be that way because of the way that you kill your sister immediately, but then instead of doing that stuff, you just don't. Like, they don't replace it with something more interesting, they kind of just don't do anything with it, with their premise. And that's just a mistake, I think. Because that's a way cooler game. A game where you have a colorful cast of characters, and yeah, maybe you're limited to this binary choice of kill or don't kill, but you have to kill. Because that lets me forgive the fact you can't make other choices, because the real reason you're listening in on all these stories is because you're in the back of your mind, you're choosing who's going to die. Because you're a vampire, and you have this hunger you can't fight. And it's not a choice of to feed or not to feed. You will feed at certain intervals, or you will die, or you will be so weak, or the game will become unplayable gradually because the screen's filling up with red and you can't tell who anyone is, and you'll eventually, like, it would even be great if, like, if you hit a point where, like, your vampire, like, blood hunger meter filled up to the point where, like, you would just immediately feed on the closest person if you... like, maybe even in public, potentially endangering whether or not people know you're a vampire and stuff like that. Like, the game should do that. The game should be like, it should just force you to eat somebody, like, against your will, eventually, if you just keep refusing for too long. Like, that would be a way more interesting game. And then you're like, well, I don't want to lose control and kill somebody who's good, right? So I should, like, force myself to feed then at certain intervals and go find some criminals or some murderers or whatnot. And then the difference between different players, role-playing wise, would be one, you have the KOTOR difference, light side, dark side. Like, are you somebody who feeds as little as possible or somebody who feeds as often as possible? Which is a dichotomy that's set up by the Necroscope series. There's the Blood Brothers trilogy of the Necroscope franchise, which is a 13-book series, but the Blood Brothers is a 3-book series that takes place on an alternate world because the rest of the series is on Earth. and there's a whole kingdom of vampires, and the world's divided between Sunside and Starside, because there's an area where it's mostly daytime and mostly nighttime, but there's like a wobble to the orbit where like it's mostly daytime, but every now and then there's a long night on the daytime side and a long day on the nighttime side and stuff like that, where that's when it's time to like, where the vampires raid the human villages and so on and so forth. But like there's certain vampires that are blood crazy warmongers, and then there's the vegan vampires, basically the ones that think highly of themselves and don't take part in such barbaric practices, and they kind of have like their, I mean, they still have slaves and everything. They're vampires, but they think they're the better ones, and so they only feed when they absolutely have to, and they put it off for a very long time, and they're very proud of themselves. And it's actually a really interesting setup. And by the way, there I am dipping into another vampire story. God damn it! How many Shit, I know a lot of vampire stories, and I didn't think I did. All right, how did I forget? Yeah, how did I not immediately think of the long ass book franchise I read about vampires? All right. I don't think of myself as a vampire fan, and I don't engage in the media too often, but apparently I've picked shit up over the years. I'm almost 30, I guess I've had time. But like that's an interesting little, you got the class divide of like the fucking aristocrats that are so entitled and so privileged that they get to feel good about themselves by being less barbaric than the other ones. It's like the concept of a good slave owner in the American South back in the day. Like the slave owners that think that they're one of the good ones because the other ones are so much worse, but it's like they're all slave owners. What the fuck? Like, how did you convince yourself that you were anything other than bad? How did I unselect my skill? What the fuck? I don't know how I did that. I just don't have my skill equipped. Whoops. Like, there's all those different things. Like, there's a lot of interesting things you can do with the societal stuff. But like, you'd be the difference between those two. It'd be one role-playing difference you have access to, is like, are you somebody who feeds as much as possible to gain unlimited power at all cost, or are you somebody that like wants to be like a vegan vampire, basically, and try not to disrupt the society, and maybe just try to go after the people that, maybe they deserve to die anyway, or at least in your drug addict brain, you're at least able to like justify to yourself that they deserve to die, when of course they probably don't on some level, and could probably be rehabilitated by a prison system or so on and so forth. But you're a vampire and you got to pick somebody, so pick the worst, right? And so like there's three versions. Like there's the two major versions, the bloodthirsty vampire and the vegan vampire. But then within the vegan vampires, then you have the moral grayities of individual people's biases and so on, and what they particularly feel about individual groups. Like, I had a strong resentment for the people that are actual snake oil salesmen. Like, it's the middle of a plague and you're selling fake cures to people. That's incredibly damaging. But you know what's even more damaging? A religious zealot that burns people alive in their beds because while taking pride in the fact that, like, he's freeing whores and lesbians and stuff like that from their fate of existing. So it's like he's cleansing the plague through the most barbaric way ever. But on some level, it's kind of a good thing that he's fighting the plague on some level, but he's doing it in a horrible, horrible, horrible way. But also he's using it as an excuse to act out his bigotry, and he's punishing people for their way of life and just being a monster and so on. And so, like, you bet your ass I made a fucking special trip at the end of the playthrough to make sure I got him, even though I didn't even need the experience. But somebody else might be more religious and might not be bothered as much by his biases and bigotries or so on, or might be less willing to attack somebody because of their religious beliefs, even though their religious beliefs are monstrous or so on. Or some people might be less willing to, some people might take pity or be unwilling to attack the guy who's creating snake oil to sell to people, basically, because they're like, well, you know, like, he's got a disability and he just lives in this one room and it gives him something to take pride in, and I'm not gonna attack a blind man, am I? Or like or something like that. Like, there's a bunch of other things going on where, like, somebody might not want to attack somebody for a whole bunch of different reasons, and that's interesting. But it's only interesting if you have to do it. If they don't make you do it, then it's just a mess. I'm supposed to get the malice here. Yep. Because what they did instead is they just give you experience for killing people. If you eat people, you get an experience boost. And that's it. And it's like, okay. But on some level, the game's not super hard, so like you can kind of get through the game without leveling up. In fact, a lot of the reviews of the game point out that they went through and did a pacifist run, and they were able to beat the game without that much difficulty. Wanderbot did a pacifist run. A bunch of people do pacifist runs, and the game even rewards you for doing a pacifist run by giving you, like, the good ending and stuff like that. But, like, that's kind of fucked up, because, first of all, the only interesting thing about this game mechanically is the choice of who to eat. Because they already sacrificed all interpersonal relationships and character development and so on of these characters to make them all modular, so the game simulation can continue if you kill any individual character. That's a thing that a lot of RPGs struggle with if they let you kill absolutely everyone, is how do you let the world and narrative work when any character could be removed at any time from it? Like, that's a problem. And so that game balances that by making them all kind of not that important. And so, like, okay, cool, but if you're gonna make them not important, then you gotta, like, fully invest in the idea of making them worthwhile character, I'm sorry, if you're gonna make them not worthwhile characters, not interact with the narrative properly, then you better fully invest in the reason you made that happen. And the reason they did that was so that you could kill them, or have the option to kill them. But then they don't fully invest in the choice to kill them or not kill them, because they then make it completely optional, which means that a significant part of the audience will then not engage with that mechanic, especially if they find out that the good ending is locked behind not engaging with that mechanic. And so then they get a suboptimal experience of the entire game, where they're just actively refusing to take part in the only interesting part of the entire game. And that's on the developer. That's not entirely on the player. That's on the developer themselves for not incentivizing you or requiring you to engage in that kind of mechanic. Like, if Pathologic just didn't give you a hunger meter and didn't give you an exhaustion meter, but we're like, hey, you can eat and sleep if you want to, you know, if you feel like it, then you can't blame the player for not doing that, because they're like, dude, I got a clock to deal with and so on and so forth, like, I gotta hurry. And like, I'm not gonna sleep and eat. Why would I bother with doing that? It's a waste of money and time if I don't have to do it. And that's why that shit's mandatory, because it's important to the game to make it mandatory. And if you take out the basic incentive structures of a game and why it works, then you get kind of like a flat nothing. And this is displayed by two recent things that have happened. One is I played a game called Rend with Bird, Durf, and Wander, and it's a game about three bases. It's a survival game, but it's a PvP survival game where three separate factions are all building up their base towards a certain goal, and you're competing to get everything done as fast as possible, and maybe sabotage each other or whatnot, and do stuff like that. I can't give you the most accurate description of the game because we were playing it wrong, and the unfortunate thing is that, yeah, we were playing the game wrong. Instead of doing that stuff, what we were doing is we were just playing it alone with the three of us on one team and no enemies, and it's like, within 2 sessions, I'm already like, I kind of don't want to play this game anymore, because what's the goal? What are we doing? There's like, I'm just mindlessly crafting more things to craft more things and building more things to build more things. There's no outside threats. There's no structure to the systems of this game. There's no reason to continue, and I don't understand why we're playing. And so I'm kind of hoping we never play that again for that reason, or I've been making the point repeatedly in our private chat, like, if we're gonna do this again, like, I really want to play on the public server again, where there's like hundreds of players and everything, and we can just like hang out and experience the real game at least, because like it or don't like it, at least play the real game instead of that. And there was also the more recent thing of like, I think it was Dead Rising 3 and 4, or at least definitely 4, just removed the clock from Dead Rising. And like the constant ticking clock in Dead Rising is the whole point of Dead Rising. If you take that out, it's just Dynasty Warriors. It's just a game where you mindlessly grind giant hordes of zombies for the sake of it, and that's it. Because the combat's not interesting in Dead Rising. The world, like a very important core element of this entire thing is running around across a map, knowing your routes, avoiding hazards, having a risk of whether you want to save at certain times or not, because saving itself is a time-consuming process where you have to go to a location and so on. Like, that's all core to the mechanics, and when you remove those mechanics from the game, you just get a really mindless button mashy game where you kill hundreds of zombies very slowly in a not very satisfying not the most exciting combat system at the very least, and like you neuter the core of the game. And I feel like that's what Vampyr is. It's a game that launched. It's a Dead Rising that doesn't have its clock, or in this case, it's in its case, it's a vampire game that launched without its vampire. Like, it just doesn't have it. You don't have to be a vampire in that game, and so that with that incentive structure gone, like, then the core of the game doesn't make sense, and everyone's gonna get a suboptimal experience, more or less. Like, I got a suboptimal experience. I was killing people, but I was doing it because I forced myself to artificially engage in this mechanic because of the fact that it was kind of not there. So I was like, I just told myself, I'm going to use this mechanic and engage with it on purpose, because if I don't, I kind of have nothing to do in this game. And that's like a problem. And so that's the biggest indictment I can make of the entire game, is not its narrative or anything else, but the fact that it clearly set up and compromised and harmed many of the elements of its game, specifically to set up the idea that you could kill anybody, but then forgot or refused or maybe pulled up at the last second because they didn't have confidence in their mechanic, maybe, and they were afraid people wouldn't like it, and so they didn't just sit it out, and that's a bummer too. And they didn't commit to the main premise of their game, and then what we got was a game that's compromised and doesn't do anything well and isn't really worth playing. Like, it's just not great. Its story is not interesting. Like, the main story is not actually good. And its resolution is kind of, really? Like, kind of a waste. Its interesting mechanic is under-invested in, so and most players won't even interact with it, apparently, because all everyone wants to keep wanting to get the good ending. Its combat's not good. It's just go play Bloodborne. It's trying to be Bloodborne, but it's a really awkward, like, not entirely balanced, but mostly just not very polished version of Bloodborne, where the controls aren't great, the camera's not great, your animations and everything, like, everything has like a weird wrongness to it that's hard to articulate, because I'm not a master of like the visceral parts of game design or anything. I'm not a master of any parts of game design, but I feel more confident talking about elements of story and mechanical incentives than I am talking about the moment-to-moment action and like how many frames a swing has or whatever the fuck that stuff is. But I can confidently say that the game has a iffy camera that sometimes you just can't tell what's happening in the fight, which is not great. And that's pretty objective and clear, regardless of your opinion of everything else. But yeah, it's an interesting first try at a Western RPG from the studio. I hope, on some level, I find myself hoping that they'll re-release it as a better game. Like, they'll do like a, what is it, what are games that made themselves entirely? Pathologic did a retranslation. Hydrophobia made Hydrophobia Pure, where they re-released the game. No Man's Sky had No Man's Sky Next. I didn't play Hydrophobia Pure or No Man's Sky Next to any extent yet, so I can't tell you if they're actually market improvements or even good in their own right. But, you know, sometimes games get a redo where they're like, we fixed everything. We fucked up the first version, sorry. Final Fantasy XIV was an MMO that was taken down and then came back out as a game that, as far as I can tell, based on everyone's impressions of it, is significantly improved, apparently. I never played either version, so I don't know. I find myself wishing for Vampyr to get that treatment, where I kind of want Vampyr to become a better video game. Because what we got is not what that game should have been, even based on what seems to be, as far as I can tell, its own mission statement. It just did not succeed at its own goal. It's not a disastrously bad game, it's just passable. Like, I'm leaning into it heavily, and it sounds like an absolute disaster, and in my brain it kind of is, honestly, but it's, you know, it's a competent, fine video game. Some story happens at you, you hit people, you get to progress through a thing, feel like you won a thing by the end, and so on. Like, if you're somebody who, like, enjoyed Resident Evil 6, then this is another example of, like, a game that's just, it's fine. It gives the visual impression of being a high-quality purchase for you to buy, and it's playable, and you can go through it. And it's, like, if you're in the undemanding sort where you're like, it's like, well, it's not full of glitches, and I got to play through the game, and it looked all right, and it played all right, then if that's all you're looking for, then it's fine. But as far as a game that like has meaningful mechanics that work together in any sort of good way, or is worthy of being any sort of classic or anything, it fails on those fronts. It's just, it ultimately rises to a level of being disposable while having way more interesting ideas that should have been explored, and it very well could have been like a modern hit or a cult classic or something, but instead it's going to be forgotten by next year, probably, and no one's gonna ever talk about it again because it just wasn't particularly good. And that'll be the ultimate judge, I suppose. I didn't hate my time playing it because once again it was fine, but it has so much to learn from so many other forms of media, and yeah, and also from its own ideas. Just I want riskier games. I want games that take a risk, do something crazy, and just fucking commit to it and do it at all costs. That's how we got Dark Souls, and you know I like Dark Souls, and obviously. But like Dark Souls, for those that don't know, Demon's Souls was originally going to be published by Sony, and then Sony's executives were like, ugh, this game sucks. No. Like it was rejected from being published for being too low quality of a product. Demon's Souls, the predecessor to Dark Souls, kind of turned out to be a big deal, you know? But it was dismissed from being published because of how low quality it was. But they stuck it out. They stuck to the game that they were working on, and they gave us that game. What happened is Atlas picked it up, and Atlas published it. And then somehow, I don't even know what the fuck happened, honestly. I'm a little confused by it, because somehow Sony is still involved in it, and it's a PlayStation exclusive. But like, it's interesting to me that now that company now publishes a bunch of they keep putting out games that are like Sony published and stuff like that, and I'm like, man, Sony's sure lucky that you forgave them, huh? Because Sony was like, yeah, these guys suck, get them out of here originally, and now there's like a bunch of, they're making multiple Sony exclusives, including Bloodborne and their upcoming VR game and so on. But yeah, people sticking to their artistic integrity and their idea and really going in on there is how you get interesting games like Dead Rising or Pathologic or Dark Souls. And people sanding off all the edges because they're afraid that they might lose part of their target audience, ultimately I think risk losing all of their audience because they don't make a game that stands out from the crowd and isn't interesting and doesn't strike out its own path. And I think Vampyr could have been that and kind of wasn't. Anyway, that was a very long rant about that, and I'm back at town with a full inventory. This is a good time to cut the episode, and then between episodes I can sort out my inventory and everything. Like always, guys, if you want to ask a question, just send me a message on Patreon, and it gets added to my inbox. I'm kind of jumping around at random a little bit, because I don't want to entirely answer these questions in chronological order, just because, one, some people ask several consecutive questions, and two, I don't want to make it feel like, oh, you're doomed to have to wait several weeks to have your question answered if you ask it now. So I'm kind of answering one... I think my pattern right now is to answer one question that's like one of the oldest questions, and one question that's one of the newest questions, and then I kind of just wing it from there. Maybe I'll do the next oldest question, or maybe I'll pick one from the middle or something, just so that you guys don't feel like you're completely doomed to have your question not get answered until a very long time from now, but also that inevitably will happen to somebody no matter what, because that doesn't mean I'm answering the questions faster or anything, I suppose. But yeah, send me a message on Patreon to ask me a question. This time I got through 4 of them, I guess. That might be the average, I don't know. Some of these questions are done in like 60 seconds, and some of them take me an hour, and I don't know how much I'll say about it until I'm done. I could probably talk even more about Vampyr, but I did already talk about it at length during the playthrough itself, and also, I don't know if I want to do a full rundown of every vampire thing I've ever watched, because although there are some ones to go in on, and so on. That's pretty much it. Thank you guys for your continued support. The Patreon has exploded. It'll be interesting to see how the next vote goes, when it's time to do the next vote after Beyond Good and Evil is over, because it's just more people now, and in particular I think there's more nominators now, so that I'm curious to see how long that list will get. And I do grapple sometimes with the idea of like, should I change the requirement for nominations to be higher so fewer people nominate? Like, is there a point where you get so many nominations that the list is too unwieldy? But on some point I kind of don't want to do that either. As long as there's a lot more people voting than nominating, the whole vote still works at the very least. But there's definitely, I don't know, there's reasons to go in all directions. I don't want to tell the current people that they're unworthy or anything like that. So that's one reason why I'm not in a hurry to change it. But it's a lot of nominators. It's a lot of nominators. If I ever did that, I would probably change the purpose of the $15 roll when I add the high. If I added a higher one. Because I still want to reward people with something. One thing I noticed is that when I got rid of the $50 reward tier for the sponsored playthrough episode things, is a decent number of those people never, despite me messaging them and trying to tell them like, hey, you know, opt into one of the other reward tiers, please. You can still donate, like you can still give me $50, but be in the $15 tier. But a lot of people did not make the move, and they're now sitting in the no reward section of Patreon, and I'm like, I mean, I contacted them. I guess they just want it this way. I don't know what to say, because I don't know why they won't move to a reward tier so they can, or whatever. I don't know. Some people, there's also the issue of like some people. I think some people don't check their emails correctly or often enough or something, or some people have Patreon going into their spam filter, and I can't fix these problems for everybody, but hey, if you haven't been getting emails, check your spam filter and maybe whitelist Patreon emails or something. Or I guess you could just manually check Patreon, but manually checking Patreon works better for the Q&A series because you know when it's going to come, which is on Saturdays, generally. But the vote kind of blindsides people, so you kind of want the email notifications to be happening, so I recommend making sure they're coming in. This is going longer than I meant to, but I have closing stuff I wanted to get through, so I guess we're going to do this now. Oh, right, the other thing I wanted to talk about, okay, so first of all, if you have feedback about this series, leave it as a comment either on the video itself or on the post on Patreon. I recommend not leaving me feedback about this Q&A series as a message, because largely I'm treating my inbox as, you know, an inbox for the messages at the moment. I need to read through them all. I have not read through all of them yet, so I haven't vetted them all, and I need to get through that, but I haven't quite had the time. But yeah, like some of them, there's a lot of, first of all, there's a lot of them. Some of those might not be questions. Some of them might just be people trying to actually talk to me about something. So I need to go through those. But yeah, if you have feedback about this series, leave them as comments as opposed to messages, because that's not what I'm using the messages for as right now, and so on. I'm also considering like how to promote this series. Obviously, it's already been promoted this month because I did the whole video about it coming out and everything, which led to a bunch of you guys showing up in the first place. But the smart thing is to promote it periodically. Like, the Patreon credits is self-explanatory. People see the credits. Patreon chosen series. That's one thing that promotes itself because it's public also. But this is a secret feature of the Patreon. It's been announced now, and people can see it on the Patreon potentially, but like, or at least they will when I add it, when I update all my descriptions and stuff. But the issue is that the YouTube audience, which is my audience generally, as time goes on, will become less and less aware of this if they didn't know about it the first time. So I'm thinking about making promotional stuff. And I'm not entirely sure what form that might take. It might be that once every like 2 months or so like every 8th Q&A, I might make one of the Q&As public as like a teaser, and like, hey, this is part 3. There's 8 of them right now. If you want to have all access to all of them, go to my Patreon. Or I might edit it down so it's just one individual question of that video, and be like, hey, you want to watch the rest of this video? Come to my Patreon, and also there's 8 parts so far, or whatever, that kind of stuff. I might go that way. And I just want to hear your guys' feedback, because are you cool with that? Because you are paying into this tier, and this is a thing you're getting. Are you happy? Are you okay with these videos becoming public eventually after a significant timed release? Like, you had exclusive for like months, but then, you know, one video like peeks out every now and then, or like one question or something. Is that Do you not feel like you're losing value when that happens, and so on? I think that's the way to go. But that's about it. Thanks for your guys' continued support. Send in more questions. Keep them coming, because if they dry up, then I'll have to come up with something else to do on Saturdays, I guess. Or something. Thanks for watching like always, guys, and I'll see you next time.